So just a quick summary. In chapter 7, we were speaking about the klipot, defining what they are. Klipot means husks or peels. There are peels that are redeemable, peels that are not redeemable, fruits of that hide under peels that are redeemable, and fruits that hide under peels that are not redeemable. That's why they're called peel, klipot. Now, what this means is that you have the realm of permitted and you have the realm of asur, of prohibited. It is our duty here, part of our mission on earth, is to go to the realm of the permitted and elevate it to the level of holiness. So the many examples that we used were, for example, when we eat and we take that energy to do good, then we've elevated the food that we ate from the realm of permitted to the realm of holy, because it became holy through our actions that were fueled by the energy of that food. Now, the realm of the prohibited cannot be touched. It's prohibited. God defined it as prohibited, and therefore the only way we can relate to it is by not relating to it, by saying no. And chapter 8 now will go more into the definition exactly, and the complex layers of each of those two klipot, each of those two peels. And okay, so let's continue here, speaking about what's called shalosh klipot at meot, the three impure klipot, which really refer to the realm of the prohibited. And that's what he started speaking with here on page 200. Started speaking about here on page 204. And nevertheless, the vitality contained therein. Does anyone want to read? This is not speaking about, again, the elevation of foods. So if it's a prohibited food, it can't be elevated. That's what it's saying. If it's a permitted food, then it can be elevated by the way we bless it, and then by the way we use its energy to do good. But let's continue. Does anyone want to read? Bottom of page 204.
I'll read.
Anyone? Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Nevertheless, the vitality contained therein does not ascend and become clothed in the words of the Torah or prayer, as in the case with permitted foods. Although there is no willful transgression on the part of the person, the offering to God is not accepted. Regarding the korbanot offerings, certain laws govern what is fit and what is not fit to ascend from the altar. And if something that is not fit is offered, even by mistake, even if one who offers it completely blameless, God does not accept the offering, for it is contrary to his will. By the same token, the energy within the non-kosher food cannot ascend to holiness. By reason for its being bound, isur, in the hands of the sitra achra of the three profound klipot.
Right, exactly. So we can say, well, we're doing good with the energy of the non-kosher food, which is the example he's using here. But again, maybe you're doing good and that action is a good deed, but you are not elevating the non-kosher food because God decided that it's prohibited. Now you may ask, well, how do we know, right? How do we know what's prohibited and what's permitted? Again, based on what the Torah says. The Torah defines the structure of the world, so to speak. There you can go, there you can't go. You can turn left, you can turn right, you can't go straight, whatever it may be. That's why it's very often referred to as the GPS of life. It tells us where to go and where not to go, right? That's what the Torah is. And God decided, therefore, what is permitted and what is prohibited. Sometimes we understand why it is why things that are prohibited are prohibited. Sometimes we don't. But it doesn't mean that if we don't understand, then we can automatically immerse in that world, because at the end of the day, God is the creator of the world and he created these boundaries. And we have to respect the creation within which we found ourselves. We have to work. We have to actualize our mission. I will say this, that, I think God on purpose sometimes gives us prohibitions that cannot be understood. And not just because he wants to remind us that at the end of the day, there's a God, but also it's almost like it's a deeper idea, but the Maggid of Mezrich, one of the great Hasidic masters, would say that if God were to be fully understood, then God would not be a God I would want to believe in. He's fully understood. Why do I need him? I have my brain. I don't need God. When God is not fully understood, that's a God I can believe in. because I recognize that there's something greater than just my human brain, my capacity to understand. And I think in a way, God therefore creates this realm of prohibited sometimes that is not understood. Nonetheless, we can't touch it, like the Tanya says here. But again, he doesn't do that just because he wants to make life difficult. He does that, first of all, to provide a GPS for life. But secondly, also to remind us that there's a God and that we don't live in a jungle, and then we're accountable to something that is greater than the human brain. To use the worst example and the most extreme example, but the Nazis were very intellectual people. In Germany, was producing the best musicians of the time, the best philosophers of the time, you name it. But they relied solely on the human brain. And at the end of the day, if the human brain, like the Nazi brain, told them that they can murder Jews, they murder Jews because according to their human brain, it made sense in the most evil and despicable way. But if you're accountable to a God that you recognize that he's greater than you, and God tells you do not murder, even if you think you can murder, you can't murder. It tells you do not murder because it's something greater than your brain. So to generalize this idea here that the Tanya is presenting, again, God doesn't just create realms of forbidden foods or forbidden items just because he wants to make life difficult. He wants to provide meaning, GPS for life, but at the same time, he's also there to remind us, hey, you're not living in a jungle here. There are rules. There's a God. And you can make this life divine if indeed you follow the divine structure. And it demands a lot of courage, a lot of humility, but I think it's the only thing that really makes this world sane and accountable. So that's the deeper reason here behind the realm of the Shalosh Klipot Atmeot, the three impure peels, or what is known again as the realm of Asur, of prohibited. I'd love to hear your comments. I don't want to be monologuing.
Mm.
I think one of the presidents of the United States, one of his favorite lines was, I think it was George Bush, the father. I'm not sure. That he would sometimes give impossible instructions to people and they would ask him why. And he would reply, because I'm the president and you're not. But in a way, God is saying that through these prohibited items, not to boast in any way, shape, or form, not at all, but to remind us that there's a structure and this world is not a jungle. As the Talmud says, Yesh manhig labirazu, that there's a leader to this place. It's not just a free-for-all.
It's like a child who has to listen to the father, and the father tells him, don't do that. And they say, why? And so, because I'm your dad and I know better.
That's it.
So
Exactly.
we're like the children of God. Right?
That's true. By the way, sometimes it works in education, sometimes it doesn't. Most times I would say in our generation, at least, it doesn't. Previous generations, it would work maybe a little more. But luckily, we have a God also that is all compassionate, all loving, and that gives us most of the reasons to most things. And in a way, through that, invites us to come and understand him and connect with him, mind to mind. You know, there's a commandment that says, Da et Elokei avicha, that you should know your father, God, to translate almost literally. But how can we know him? He's infinite. Again, the human brain can't completely grasp him. So number one, we can grasp some sides of him. And that we still have to do that. And number two, it's true. Sometimes we can't grasp him, but it's our duty to nonetheless try. That's why maybe Judaism is all about questioning and all about, engaging, because we have to try. There are 19 words in the Talmud for questioning. I think more. I think 19. Reflecting again how much we have to question, the art of questioning in Judaism. But nonetheless, when we've questioned and we've exhausted all intellectual options and we still can't grasp God's mind, that's when we say, okay, Fine. Even though I don't understand it, I still do it. Because again, I recognize that I'm not the creator of the world. God is creator of the world. And I have to abide to his creation and to his rules and ensure that this world doesn't become a jungle. You know, I think we've mentioned this many times, but there are studies about this, that people that believe in God are in a way nicer people than people who don't believe in God. That's why I really believe that, you know, matters, but at the very end of the day, it doesn't quite matter what religion you're in. You know, whether you're a Christian or Buddhist or Muslim or Hindu or whatever it may be, as long as you have a higher power to report to, I think it makes you nicer because you're more accountable. You recognize that it's not just me and my decisions and my way of living. And you know, one of the studies I think we've mentioned in the past is that students, for example, cheat less in bright rooms than they do in dark rooms. Because in bright rooms, they're being watched, so they don't cheat. Or they cheat less. But again, that's the idea, that when I know that I recognize that there's a God, then I behave a little more. That's, by the way, the reason we wear this. Women are more spiritually inclined, and really that's the reason. So they don't have to wear this. But men are more coarse, are less spiritually inclined, and therefore we need a constant reminder that there's a God on top of us, that we're accountable. We can't just do what we want. And yes, sometimes we don't understand why God says no, but it's a no. And that's really the idea here of Isur, of being bound. God says, I'm sorry, there's a structure to my world. You want to always be able to understand it. But if you want to live a meaningful life, and a life that is a coherent and harmonized life, then you got to follow my rules. You know, we're all like wary about all these cameras watching us all the time. It's unbelievable how many, you know, cameras are filming us during the day. Apparently, the average American is filmed about 75 times a day. Whether you go to the elevator, or to the gas station, or the supermarket, or whatever it is, you're being filmed. And people are shocked. What? My privacy is... But we're being filmed 24 hours a day by one camera. And that's God himself. And yes, he's watching you, and he wants you to behave the way you ought to behave. Now, in many ways, I think that if people would tune into that camera, not only would they not be shocked, but they would be better behaved. But we're tuned into all these other cameras and we try to avoid them all the time. But there's one camera that can't be avoided. Now, that's why, you know, during this period of time between Passover and Shavuot, we read the ethics of our fathers each and every Shabbat. It fits perfectly because there are 6 Shabbats between Passover and Shavuot. So every Shabbat, we read one of the 6 chapters of the ethics of our fathers. One of the Mishnahs of the ethics of our fathers is Ain Ro'ah, Ve'ozen Shomat, V'chol Ma'asecha B'sefer Nichtavim. Then one should remember 3 things at all times. Ain Ro'ah, there's an eye that sees. 2, there's an ear that hears. And 3, there's a hand that writes down all of your actions and records them forever. And when a person lives in such a way that he knows that there's an eye that watches, an ear that hears, and a hand that records all of his actions, that he behaves automatically a little more in a more elevated way, a more lined way, a more meaningful way. So that's really the big idea behind the laws of Asur. Things are prohibited. Sometimes we don't understand them, but again, they're there to remind us that there are those 3 things: an eye that sees, an ear that hears, and a hand that's recording and writing all of our actions. By the way, the only actions that are not recorded forever are the actions that we do teshuvah on. Those are erased from our book. But when we go up to heaven after 120, we're given this book. We're presented this book. The story of our life. And even on a deathbed, if we do teshuvah, we have the power to erase some of the bad chapters of that book, the bad lines of that book. That's the power of teshuvah. But again, it's a reminder that this book records everything, or God records everything in this book. So we have to be cognizant of that, and I think it makes people better people. Anyhow, I've spoken too much, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. Anyone? Oh, okay. All right. So let's continue then. We can continue a little bit more. Page 205, Isur. So going now into those two realms of forbidden and permitted. They refer to as Isur and Heter in Hebrew. Isur means forbidden, Heter means permitted. Does anyone want to read? Anyone?
I can read this one maybe.
Oh, please. Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Isur, forbidden, bound, and heter, permitted, unbound, are not subjective concepts. They do not relate to the person, nor does the person define them by his knowledge and awareness. A person's knowledge or ignorance does not alter the basic definition of a thing as Isur or heter.
Right.
A positive intention, such as the intent for the sake of heaven, for a holy purpose, does not prevent something forbidden from being forbidden. The nature of the forbidden thing is not altered by a person's intentions, because the prohibition is objective, relating to the composition, nature, and characteristics of the thing itself, and not to what somebody happens to think about it.
Right.
This conception of good and evil rejects the emotional and subjective view many have of these definitions, the outlook by which everything is assessed according to a person's intentions. This view does not recognize the concept of an act as is intrinsically evil, but it does recognize personal sins, acts that derive from the intention to do evil. The act itself, the reality of its being done or not, is devoid of significance. But the concept of Isur, as defined here, is not a factor of the person's conscious desire to transgress the divine will, but of the fact that he did so even if unintentionally. An evil intention, a deliberate rebellion against God, is a sin in its own right, but it doesn't in any way define what is in the realm of the forbidden.
Right. So what Rabbi Strauss is saying here is that there's a limit to our intent, to our intention. Our intention can indeed define and guide our actions, but only the permitted ones. The forbidden ones, they're forbidden. So no matter how much intention and how much effort you put in trying to guide them into the right path, they remain forbidden. So there's a limit to how much the intent that we have can indeed influence the actions that we take. Yes, intent is important. Intent, in a way, affects the mind tremendously and affects the psyche of the person altogether. But at the end of the day, it can't transform the forbidden actions, because the forbidden actions are structured by something that is greater than us and therefore can't be influenced by us. And that something is God. God already structured them as forbidden, so they're forbidden. We have no power, no matter how much effort we try and put into it, to change the definition of God himself, or human beings at the end of the day. Now, this is what this is saying. But I think it also speaks to something that is very powerful, and that is that at the end of the day, the actions of a person count much more than the intention of a person, which we've been speaking about. And if the action is a permitted one, then it can really create a divine impact on the world by using those permitted actions and elevating them to the realm of holiness. Again, whether it's eating food and fueling, being fueled by the energy of the food to do good, or whether it's maybe even something simpler, just using a simple conversation to make someone smile. It's a simple conversation. It's not eating. It's not even doesn't demand so much effort, but you make someone smile. So there you go. You've elevated what seems to be so mundane and banal into something very holy. And that doesn't demand much intent either. But that action can reverberate in the world much more than any intent can. That action will have a ripple effect in the world much, much more than any intention can, no matter the greatest intention, doesn't matter. And this is what this is saying in a way. So you have the forbidden actions that can be touched, can be transformed. God decided that they're forbidden, as we just spoke about. But then you have the permitted actions. There's so much we can do there, so much more than any intention. And therefore, and this is my point, therefore, I would often recommend to people that even if they're not in the mood, even if your intention today is not up to par, even if you're feeling down, even if you say to yourself, oh, I have no strength and I have no connection, no emotional connection to this action today, I just don't feel it, right? We hear that all the time. Even if that's the case, do it anyway. Why? Because at the end of the day, yes, your intentions count, but what counts most is the action. That's what counts most. And that action of itself is much, much more important at this moment than your mood and the way you're feeling. And this is in a way hinted here very beautifully in the words of Rabbi Steinsaltz, that the intents have a limit. Actions don't have a limit. Permitted actions have no limit. That's the difference between the two. Intentions are finite. Actions, good actions, are infinite. Why? Because they create infinity. They create a ripple effect in the world that goes on and on and on. You know, we just had COVID. Not us as individuals, I'm saying our world had COVID. And if something proved that more than COVID, I don't know what it is, but one cough, one sneeze could change the world. It's quite amazing. That's always been true. I just read about this, but the Lubavitcher Rebbe writes about Lag BaOmer. We just celebrated Lag BaOmer, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's Yortzeit, in which we commemorate his passing. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was one of the greats of Jewish history, who, as we all know, authored the Zohar, and himself also was maybe single-handedly responsible for preserving Judaism in times of immense persecution by the Romans. He wanted to obliterate Judaism. He was also a man who really was recognized by all of his peers as unique soul, who came from the highest of worlds. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe speaks about how when we study the words of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai on Lag BaOmer, or for that regard, the words of any righteous person, he quoted the Talmud that says that the words of the righteous person that we are studying cause a movement of lips by that righteous person in his or her grave. So when I study Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's words, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's lips are moving in his grave. And the movement of those lips create a ripple effect in the world that can bring ultimate redemption to the world. Mm-hmm. A very deeply mystical concept, but a very powerful one. Because when I'm studying the words of someone, I'm not just studying his words, I'm making his lips move, whether physically, which I believe could be the case, or metaphorically, it doesn't matter. You're reviving that person's lips. And because you're making him speak through you or through your study. So no way, his lips are being revived at that moment. Metaphorically, it certainly makes sense, but physically, you have to have a mystical inclination to believe that it makes sense. But I think it makes sense. Yeah. And what I'm saying is that this proves again how one little movement of lips, just like anything in this world, and science now proves it, one little cough, one little sneeze, or one flap of butterfly wings, as was the study in 1964, can cause a tsunami in Indonesia, even if it came from Brazil. Now, because again, everything that we do has a reaction. Newton's law, every action is a reaction. Every movement of lip can then bring about redemption to the entire world. So what this again emphasizes is that action is so much more important than intention. And therefore, even if we're not in the mood, just do it, as Nike says, right? Because that action is really touching upon infinity. Intentions are very finite. So that's the big idea.
It brings to mind the expression, the road to hell is paved by good intentions.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. The flip side of it, I don't know if it exists, that expression, but if the road to hell is paved by good intentions, then maybe the road to heaven is paved by good actions.